Hello, hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. Who here is here for the first time today? Oh, okay. A lot of really good faces. Welcome, welcome. We hope to have you back with us one day. We always have something on the calendar here, and tonight is just one of 10 author events that we are having in May. In fact, this time next week, we'll be hosting Abigail Leonard for her book, Four Mothers, about four real women in Finland, Japan, the US, and Kenya in their first year of motherhood. All the information about our upcoming events and our 14 different book clubs can be found on our website or on our Instagram. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you would take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, hello Zoom crowd, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can see them and can ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you need to purchase a copy of tonight's book, we have them available upstairs at the cash register, not on the shelves, and they can be purchased prior to the signing line. And now the reason we're here tonight. If you're here in the audience with us, you might be asking yourself, what happened to feminism in the 21st century? This question feels increasingly urgent after a period of cultural and legislative backlash, when widespread uncertainty about the movement's power, focus, and currency threatens decades of progress. Sophie Gilbert identifies an inflection point in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the energy of third wave and riot girl feminism collapsed into a regressive period of hyper objectification, sexualization, and infantilization. Amid a collective reconsideration of the way women are treated in public, Girl on Girl is a blistering indictment of the matrix of misogyny that undergirded the cultural production of the early 21st century and how it continues to shape our world today. And I practiced that 3 times to make sure I wouldn't say all the words wrong. Our author of the evening is Sophie Gilbert, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she writes about television, books, and popular culture. She won the 2024 National Magazine Award for Reviews and Criticism and was a finalist of the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. She lives in London and is visiting us today. Joining her in conversation tonight is friend of the shop, Tayla Burney, who is a longtime public radio producer who specialized for years on author interviews and book events. Now on the programming team at NPR, she helped launch the Book of the Day podcast and is a regular contributor to Books We Love. She hopes you spend all your book dollars at local indies and have at least 2 library cards to your name. Please join me in welcoming our guests of the evening. Big round of applause. Here they come.
Hello, Sophie. It is a delight to have you here. Um, we are going to talk for a while, y'all, and then we will open it up to you for your questions. So think about those questions, have them ready. The time comes and passes fast. Sophie, congratulations on Girl and all the wonderful reviews that are coming in for it. They're super well deserved. Just saying, reading this book, I felt a lot of feelings. Felt validated in a lot of ways. I felt angry. I felt enlightened. Felt like I was making connections, connecting the dots. For anyone who's maybe coming in cold tonight who hasn't read a review yet, your thesis for this book, in some ways, is that, and I'm going to quote you back to yourself here, like a lady splainer, that the cruelty and disdain expressed toward women during the aughts seem to be more significant than it's often given credit for. What were you noticing in this cultural moment in the last couple of years from both men and women that made you really reflect on this notion and decide to tackle this project?
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. It's so amazing to see everyone here. I wanted to write this book starting in 2022, I think after Roe was overturned, because it just seemed like we'd had this period of real backlash for women. There was obviously the electoral loss of Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then there was the Me Too movement and this real outpouring of stories of abuse and harassment. And it seemed like, okay, when things are not great for women at work, things are not great for women in power. And COVID happened, and it obviously seemed that things weren't great for women at home either, and so things not going so great for women. And there were people after Roe, I think, who were passing the politics of what had happened, and it just made sense to me, I think, being a critic, to think culturally and to go back, and being an elder millennial, I think, being so steeped in this particular decade of the 2000s where so much was toxic in ways I hadn't fully passed. I was curious about seeing if I could make it make sense. So that was the background of the project.
Yeah, and as Lainey Rose teed up, also what happened to feminism, which we'll get more into. You mentioned in the book that the girl on girl title was initially kind of like a joking placeholder in some ways, but so many of the roads that you start down and follow through in this book, bringing that critical eye to the culture of the early aughts, ultimately lead to pornography. What were the factors fueling the impact of the norms of porn at the time, which were increasingly violent, that we saw really infusing the way that especially young women were being depicted across different forms of media?
I think I start the book in 1999 looking at three things that seem to kind of showcase how porn inflected culture was, especially for me as a teenager at the time. I was 16 that year. One was Britney Spears on the cover of Rolling Stone clutching a Teletubby doll in a pink and black bra. I think she was 17 when she took that cover shot. American Beauty came out, which is obviously a movie about a man who has a sexual fixation on his teenage daughter's best friend. It won 5 Oscars. When I was growing up in London, there was a children's television presenter I'd grown up watching on TV, and she had posed for a men's magazine, and without her consent, they took the pictures in which she was naked and projected them on the Houses of Parliament in the UK, where obviously the seat of government is. And it just all felt like these statements of what women were supposed to think about themselves and girls were supposed to think about themselves in this moment, and how the messaging, I think, was so ubiquitous that sex was power and sexual power was thrilling, and it was what we should aspire to, and it was what would make us feel powerful. And it wasn't really until I started going back to the research for the book that I realized how much the growth of porn during the 90s had really influenced so much of culture in this time. And that feels a little naive now, but it was fun to trace.
Sure. I mean, even just the technology, right? Like, I think the stat you have is that in 1985, roughly 75 million rentals of adult videos happened. And by 1995, it was 665 million, right? Like, and then a short time later, it's on your phone, right? Or it's on your computer, and then it's on your phone. So that proliferation is just so radical. And you just mentioned the presenter in the UK who was projected on Parliament. We did see this sort of phenomenon starting to happen where people who were owning their sexuality, who were celebrities who were known for, being desired, were having their photos and videos that were very personal shared without their permission, right? Do you think that kind of lack of consent, that loss of agency and violation, even for people who had, in theory, a status in society, right? And it happened to people who were just regular people as well, fueled ultimately the Me Too movement, and also just the conversations we have now about consent that, like, y'all, we did not have those when we were teens in the early 90s and aughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think really starting with the theft of Pamela Anderson's sex tape. And then when she protested, she was told that she couldn't fight back because she had posed for Playboy in the past and, like, obviously been eroticized in Baywatch. It was this idea that, like, well, you did this, so you can't complain. And I think what that really did was enforce the idea that famous women didn't no longer have the right to a private life. And but also this idea that really came about in the 2000s, I think, that women's bodies were now in the public domain. Like, and you saw photographers lay down on the ground to take upskirt pornography of celebrities, and then if they succeeded, they were not shamed for what they had done. It was the women who were shamed for going out without underwear. So it's just very much this idea that, and I think it crept into how all of us felt about ourselves too, particularly in the Facebook era, that, like, suddenly you didn't always get to control how you were perceived and how you were presented, and other people definitely felt entitled to, like, interpret your body for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the celebrity version of, like, not my grandma if she's watching, but like the grandma being like, you shouldn't wear that short skirt then. Like you shouldn't have dressed like that, or you shouldn't do that. You know, it's sort of that celebrity version of like you're asking for it, right? Or like you've given over the autonomy here. Um, One thing that I would love to talk to you about, because I feel like it was such a cultural touchstone of this particular period, is music videos. And they are by far not alone in showcasing that influence of porn culture, but I think it's really hard to explain to anyone who is not like waiting for MTV or VH1 to like stay locked in, coming up in 12 minutes, the next Janet Jackson video or like the new Madonna video. And that idea that like even now 20 plus years later, like you hear a song and you also see it at the same time because it's so burned into your brain. Um, that imagery and that storytelling, like the opening up of the visual storytelling to accompany music was huge. How did the work of more established stars like Madonna, like Janet Jackson, hold up and compare against the generation of pop stars coming in?
That's such a good question. It was, I think the thing that was so interesting about the arrival of, say, MTV was it transformed what it meant to be a female musician, particularly. Like before, would have been crucial, I think, was the sound that you made. And suddenly, what was much more relevant almost was what you looked like. It was how you were perceived, how you came across on film. And there were artists who I think really played out well to that, like Madonna, like Cyndi Lauper, like Janet Jackson, who really adapted well to the medium. But there were also like artists who didn't and who were sidelined because of that. But the thing I think that was kind of thrilling was the Madonna "Justify My Love" video, which I obviously talk about in the book, because it's so weird. It's so interesting. It's so arty. It sort of reflected what she would do later with her coffee table book Sex, but it was so much a kind of manifestation of her fantasies. It wasn't about how she might think men might like to watch her on camera. It was very much a presentation of her psyche, I would say. But it was also tapping into this sort of theme of voyeurism in 90s media, which in my research seemed to date back to the AIDS crisis, and this real cultural anxiety about sex and about desire. But you had these artists like Madonna, like Janet Jackson, who were very intentional about trying to reclaim sex as a source of meaning and joy and power in people's lives. And so they made these incredible, like, sex positive videos, and they were highly criticized for it. And they did, I think, unfortunately, in the process, like, really open up this mainstream Pandora's box of like sexualized imagery in media that once people saw it, they liked it. It was hard to go.
Yeah, it's tough to put that back in the box. Absolutely. And I think, as you know, like, and you write pretty extensively about this in the book, the AIDS crisis was the other factor that made it more of a norm to talk about sex, to open up conversations, because they were necessary, because they were required for protection. But as you note, there was like a, you know, again, that flip of the coin, right? Like as those conversations, which were good and important, again, like my sex ed was very lacking. Massachusetts schools do better. But you know, like I do wonder again what the blowback was on the AIDS movement, even as this happened, if that came up in your research at all.
I think what came up more in my research was the real bifurcation of there were two schools of thought, I think, that developed after AIDS. And one was called the New Traditionalism. It was named after a Good Housekeeping ad campaign that was very much like nostalgic, women, go home. It was like a woman's sighing voice being like, my mother never went to the office. It was like, it was sort of very fetishizing the home and the domestic role. And then you did see this kind of school of thought arise in media with movies like Fatal Attraction, where it was like, if you have sex, you might die. But you also at the same time saw the new, like, this very voyeuristic movement coming up that was much more upfront about sex and sexual imagery. And Madonna's videos obviously play into that, but also things like HBO's Real Sex, which when it launched was, I think, commissioned by a woman. A lot of its directors were women. And again, it saw its purpose, I think, as like making a space for sex that wasn't so colored by fear.
Yeah, and I mean, the other sort of massive phenomenon that's launching during this time, speaking of voyeurism, is reality TV, right? And there was this idea also that was being introduced of intersectionality, right? Which is literally like a new concept in the era that you're writing about. and there were these groups depicted in reality TV who were marginalized even beyond their status of being a woman, right? Like there were women of color, there were trans women and queer women um, on these shows. And I'm curious how that rise of reality TV in particular both helped and hurt the perception of those groups that experience that intersectionality in their respective cultures.
It was, I think what you saw pretty much in the earliest days of reality TV, like you said, was just this segregation. And if you were a white woman, you could go on The Bachelor and like compete for a diamond ring. If you were a woman of color, you'd be more likely to end up on like Flavor of Flav's show
Flavor of Love
in his
man.
harem, and go through this like very dehumanizing process at the beginning where he like renames them. And
Has he redeemed himself by supporting the women's right? I don't know. It's an open question. We don't have to answer it, but
I know. Well,
we
it's
love
like
to see it.
him, Eminem. I mean, the one that really fascinates me is Snoop Dogg, because everyone's been like, he's been going around recently like Uncle Snoop. He's at the Olympics. He's so beloved.
Like uncle.
He went to the VMAs in 2005, I think, with two adult women on leashes that he held. They had dog collars around their necks, and he, sorry, I had gasps over here. So and he walked in with one on each arm. And a lot of people also don't know that Snoop Dogg for 2 years in a row hosted the best-selling hardcore porn video that year, Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style. He was not in it, but he was the MC. So he was very much like self-identifying as a fixture in the porn industry at this time, and not always being very nice to women.
No, absolutely. I think what's so stark, I had totally forgotten about that image until I read about it, and then I looked it back up because I did remember it. And what was jarring that you write about at the time is like everybody's like, oh, here's Snoop, like the caption on like the Getty image is like Snoop Dogg enters the VMAs with two like companions. It's very bizarre
No,
in how normal it's
Snoop Dogg is obeying the leash law.
Oh God, you're right. It's so much worse. I think I tried to block that from my mind after I read it. No, it's fine. But I think that is, one of the things that I read recently that came to mind a lot as I was reading your book is Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, right? And I think these are the issues we kind of find ourselves grappling in with a lot of the art that we've enjoyed in the past, that we maybe still enjoy now, and sort of reckoning with these questions, right? Of the harm versus the quality of that art. And what I really love about your book, though, is that you don't necessarily pass that judgment. You sort of keep it at that critical place where we're allowed to make our own decisions. Was that hard for you? I'm a judgmental person, so I'm curious how you manage.
I think I really was conscious about not wanting to spoil anyone's fun or like take away their faves, because we need pleasure in our lives. We need fun, we need diversion. And it was less about wanting to indict things than trying to, I think, draw connections and make things seem clearer by finding patterns and hoping that people can sort of take away their conclusions for themselves without me kind of putting the hammer down. But I am happy to put a hammer down.
I mean, sometimes it's necessary. You also shared that there was, as you were sort of working on this project and talking to different editors, that there was a lot, like a decent amount of pressure to put yourself into it more, right? Which again makes sense. We are talking about the era of the rise of social media and sharing and oversharing and like, oh God, I posted that on Facebook in 2004. Why were we doing that? Was that at all difficult for you, or is that because of the nature of your work as a critic? Did that just sort of come naturally to keep yourself kind of out of it personally?
It's funny because everyone keeps asking this, and I think no, I love I love talking
how do you
about it.
feel?
No, because when I was pitching the book, everyone was like, "Can you put yourself in it more?" And I was like, "Oh, I mean, okay," because obviously I want to sell my book. So, it wasn't a conscious decision. I think it was just more of a failure. Like every time I tried to do it, it just didn't come out right. And I know there's a lot of writers here, so they know what I'm talking about. Like when you approach a piece, you have to find the right entrance to it, and you have to find the right way to frame it. And whenever I put myself in, it just seemed to be distracting from the project of what I wanted to do, which was, again, like just make things make sense in my own head, if not for anyone else. But I have written about myself in the past. I'm not averse to it. And there were moments when it made sense, I think, when I was like experiencing things contemporaneously, where it felt like it would add something if I put myself in the book. But otherwise, I really wanted it to be more of a kind of critical mode.
Yeah, no, it absolutely it works really well. And I think something that stood out to me in reading this, or that I was thinking about, is there's like this relentless positivity, right? Like I was a bit chagrined to learn that the phrase girl power originated with two members of Bikini Kill, not the Spice Girls, which is a long way from where it ended up. How did we get from point A to point B with that phrase and the adoption of it, maybe first and most famously by the Spice Girls, and then it's like proliferation across our culture?
Well,
How much time do we have?
no, I mean, Bikini Kill, growing up in the UK, I did not unfortunately know them, but I did know the Spice Girls. And so when they launched, it was this very exciting moment in my life because they were so thrilling. They were so gorgeous. They were so like fun. They were so they were so silly. The music was so great. And they had this slogan, "Girl Power," which was kind of like, okay, cool, girl power. Like, you know, doesn't. I never knew until quite recently that it had this much more activist edge when it was used, obviously, by the Riot Girl movement, by members of Bikini Kill. And the intention, I think, in putting in the phrase girl power was putting two words together that would not otherwise go together. Like, what's a word that doesn't go with power? And it was like, girl power. So the idea, I think, was a provocation in a way. It was like trying to get people to change their thinking about what kinds of people we think about when we think about power. And it was very activist. And obviously, Riot Girl had all these demands. It really wanted to make things safer for women in punk music, but also like it was very outspoken about sexual assault, about the conditions that women at the time were living under. And then it just got reclaimed by the Spice Girls and like completely defanged, right? It just didn't mean anything anymore. And it seemed so interesting to me because it really reflected what was happening in feminism too, this shift from third wave feminism, which was similarly activist and charged and outspoken and trying its best to be intersectional and inclusive, to post-feminism, which was much more about selling things, sort of celebrating so much that women have achieved, but like not really bothering about the rest because, you know, it's fine, it'll come along.
Well, I mean, that's as Lady Rose set us up, what happened to feminism, right? Like, and I think there is this, you know, that phrase, girl boss, there's like this list of terms that were sort of generated that seem like they're relentless in their positivity, right? Like, and it feels like a real projection onto the generation in a lot of ways, right? Because the Spice Girls, they came together through an ad placed by a manager, right? Who is presumably older and more experienced than them. So I wonder what you think about that sort of generational intersection with this moment, because it seems like that feminist era before, I get the sense even like from some of the women in earlier generations of my family, it's like, okay, we're good, we're here, we got it, you're good, go, live your lives, girl power. Where in reality, we're still fighting the patriarchy, just like on a different landscape. What is that line between the parts of this culture that were foisted upon this generation and that were sort of perpetuated by it?
I mean, every generation of feminism, I think, has to find the generation before it cringed in some way. And it's
true
a
about
real
generations broadly, perhaps.
No, but it's a real tragedy
that's true.
because, and so like during the events for this book that have happened earlier this week, so many people have said like what we've lost when we lose like intergenerational discussion of these kinds of things, because in reality, like nothing is new under the sun. Everyone has always experienced the same kinds of, I mean, obviously they manifest in very different ways, but the same kinds of treatment and the same kinds of misogyny. And the more willing we are to talk to each other and to sort of own, to be more comfortable, I think, with imperfection, it just creates more space for sort of meaningful discussion and comprehension of communication, shall we say.
Yeah. As you know, there is nothing new under the sun. What is not necessarily new in any art form, right, is how personal work by women is perceived, especially in like we're sitting in a bookstore. We are surrounded by narratives. More of them are by women probably now than would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right? But how that work, when it is personal in its nature, is perceived compared to works of men. You have a great line in the book saying that men who write about their lives tend to be canonized as brave auteurs of the human experience. Women who do the same are guilty of oversharing. Do you think, just sort of thinking of your critical work more broadly, we are getting to a place where women's narratives truly are getting more of their due? It depends is a fair and fine answer. But I'm curious if you think there has been significant progress. You read a bit about Nora Ephron and how Heartburn was received in the book.
Yeah, I mean, what was so interesting in the history to me was seeing how after the really ugly, dehumanizing, cruel treatment of women in media during the 2000s, you had this real moment in the 2010s of women writing about their lives and like remembering the ways in which writing was such a powerful medium during that time. And not bless it. But it really was. It was kind of, I think it was sort of like pre-Instagram and pre-TikTok. So if you wanted to say something meaningful and to sort of communicate with people, the easiest way to do it was to write it out, like write on your blog, write on like we had all these sort of rise of short form like microblogging sites
Sure.
like X. But what was powerful, I think, about the writing in this movement was it seemed very much to be women asserting like we are human. We are not like after this period of real backlash and kind of fetishization, there was so much in the first person writing of the 2010s that really asserted humanity and feeling. And I use Taylor Swift as an example too, because she came out in this moment where music was just like very bad. It was like, it was the era of like My Humps and Buttons and Moneymaker. And it was just like this very like thudding strip club moment for music. And she came out and she's like, I have feelings. I have feelings and I'm going to talk about, sing about them. And everyone was like, oh, okay. But it did kind of capture this trend where it was actually really women trying to sort of say, please, like, listen to me. I have something to say.
Yeah.
And as you sort of read in that quote, like it's the backlash is always instantaneous when a woman writes about herself. It's like, how dare you perceive yourself worthy as a subject, which is not something that happens to men. Like now Scott has like 8,000 books about his tea routine. But but with women, there's much more scrutiny. And I think it just comes from this like millennia deep tradition of men being the ones who write the history, right? And so
Yeah.
when a woman does it, there's always a kind of innate skepticism of like, what do you think you have to say?
Absolutely. And there's also this, you write about this fairy tale logic, right? That I think was especially prominent in the films of the era, whether it was Beauty and the Beast or like a Seth Rogen vehicle, right? Like there's this sense that they're laying out this narrative that an undesirable man can be redeemed by a desirable woman. How did that notion and that sort of prevalence of that type of story arc and narrative influence not just women, but the men of this generation?
Yeah, chapter 3 is about American Pie.
It's a
And
journey, y'all.
it is, and I think I was going back into it, rewatching it more times than anyone ever should watch American Pie as an adult. But
It was research.
yeah, and I was prepared to be outraged by the Nadia scenes, like where Nadia is filmed without her consent, broadcast without her consent in sexualized scenes. Like she becomes the victim of non-consensual pornography in lots of ways, and then she just disappears. Like you don't see her again. No one's like, sorry, Nadia. It, and so I was sort of prepared to be outraged by those scenes. But what surprised me almost was how sweet the movie was in lots of ways. I think it was trying to kind of move forward from the Porky's era and the Revenge of the Nerds era, where women were really like grossly abused in lots of ways. And this was a movie that I think was trying its best with its female characters and giving them space to, think about sex and talk to each other about sex and boys in ways that don't often happen in movies. But what it did in doing so was really set up the idea that girls are the gatekeeper for sex, especially for boys. And it really framed like losing your virginity as this heroic journey that like it cements your passage from boy to man and like you must get through this journey. But it kind of sets the girl up who's standing in the way as like this dragon who needs to be slayed.
Yes.
And that just became a very sticky motif throughout the rest of the decade. And I sort of make a line in the book about there's obviously a difference between the involuntarily celibate men of American Pie and the incel movement, but there is the same thread that runs between them, which is this idea that young men are entitled to sex, and that if girls deny them, they are denying them their due and this thing that they really need to complete their heroic rite of passage.
Yeah, it is an interesting insight into, like you said, that idea of sort of being owed something, right? And having, like you said, that dragon standing in the way, and surprise, it's a teenage girl who is, again, I think to your point, and you again do a great job of sort of highlighting where an effort was made. Like you could say they were trying to give them agency, right? Like, but I think to your point, it does backfire in a lot of ways, because of that dynamic.
And I think the thing too is because the pressure is suddenly being put on the girls to decide whether or not they're going to give the boys what they want, what they are demanding. It allows so much less space for the girls to think about what they want, like what they might choose, what they might desire. Like
Sure.
it just shades everything around the autonomy of like what teenage boys want.
Absolutely. In addition to watching American Pie several times, we won't count. I imagine, I mean, it shows that you did a ton of research. I imagine there was a lot that did not make it into the book. Is there anything in particular that did not make it in that is still sticking with you a bit, that you still think about and think, I want to do something with that in the future or in another project?
I think I never was really able to. I note it briefly in the book, but there were certain women who came up over and over and over again in almost every chapter, and one was Demi Moore, and it was really
Yep.
fascinating to me how she seemed to sort of exemplify shifts in womanhood in every single era. So obviously she comes out, she's like the ingenue, she's so gorgeous, and then she's like selling sex in Indecent Proposal, and she's like stripping and striptease, and I for which she was
shaving her head.
Yeah, shaving her head in GI Joe. Like
Yeah.
she was the highest paid actress in Hollywood, and she was given the nickname Gimme More because she was supposedly being pushy for her bargaining power, which again, not something that anyone was complaining about when Michael Douglas was doing it. But then she left Hollywood and moved to Idaho to raise her children in this moment when the percentage of women in the American workforce was starting to decline for the first time. She became a cougar when she married a younger man in this moment when like the archetype of the cougar was really taking off in culture, and her butt was the subject of one of the first viral tweets when Ashton Kutcher took a picture of her in a white bikini and posted it. And it very much again like cementing the idea we talked about earlier of the idea that like if you're a woman and you have a body, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the internet. But she just it was I would love to sort of examine her more, I think, at some point, because and then to see what she's doing now with the substance, it's such a kind of triumphant arc where she's really, for the first time ever, showing what she can do as an actor now that she's not held back by all this other crap.
Yeah, absolutely. No, she's really come back. Like, as you note, she had a lot of power at the height of her career, and then she did just really step back, and now she's reemerging in this really fascinating arc. I had forgotten she was married to Ashton Kutcher. And to that point, I mean, there is something about like the pace and saturation of overwhelm of information that we are living in. It is everywhere all the time. It's on our phones. It's everywhere. It's in the air. In this modern moment. And I wonder if you think that is part of what's fueling this sort of idea of reflecting on these relatively recent parts of our history, right? Because I think there's always, again, as you note, everything old is new again. There's nothing new under the sun. But I think we tend to often to look back at like previous eras and centuries prior, to learn our lessons. But I feel like this book that you've written is part of like this wonderful trend of like Cue the Sun from Emily Nussbaum, and I mentioned Monsters of Fanstilma, all these amazing memoirs that have come out, from Jessica Simpson, from Pam Anderson, right? I think we are, you're wrong about the podcast, right? Like we are reckoning with this recent history. And I wonder where you think that comes from in this wild moment we live in.
I mean, there's a lot to reckon with. So
you don't have one answer. So
no, I mean,
I'm so surprised.
I think when you're immersed in something, it's really hard to see it clearly.
Yeah.
And so much of the project for the book was like trying to understand, why did I think it was okay to like watch Brittany shaving? I remember I was working in a restaurant at the time, and my manager kept coming to get me being like, Brittany's shaving her head. And it was like this TikTok of like soap operatic drama. That we felt like it was our right to kind of consume as cultural consumers. Like it was our entertainment, right? And there was nothing obscene about that. then to me in the way that it seems
Sure.
transparently
Yes.
obscene now. And that clarity, I think, has only come with time. And it's just, so much of the messaging was so total during that era. It really was kind of saying the same thing across every different form of media that we consumed. And when that is happening, it is very hard to protest or to feed a kind of counter narrative even in your own mind. And so I don't know, my hope is that, and I'm sure the hope of all the other revisionist projects too, is that if you look at the recent past, obviously there are lessons for now, but like the patterns are always the same, and it makes it easier to identify things that are happening now and in some ways to fight back.
Well, and to that point, this will be my last question. Then I'm turning it over to you all, so you're on. Be ready with your questions. You sort of do conclude with this idea of the patterns, right? And the idea that we're in a phase, we're in an era, there will be a correction. So I wonder how you, for those of us living in this town in this moment, think about that correction in the years to come. Not to ask you to predict the future, Sophie, to be clear.
It's difficult because everything is so amplified by technology always and distorted in new ways. And so you do have this pattern of like progress, backlash, but it also gets enhanced and warped by whatever the sort of new technological medium of the time is in ways that make it much harder to anticipate and to predict. I didn't want to end on a bum note. So, but I was doing an interview and someone said, she really thought that actually at the end of the book is kind of hopeful in terms of the way that when you understand the power that all these different kinds of stories and all these different kinds of narratives have had over your own imagination and your own ideals and your own belief system and your own desires, you realize actually that storytelling can do the other thing too. And so much of what we have now is so much better, like thinking about Demi, obviously, but there has not historically been space for older women in Hollywood. There's not been space for stories about, the transition into motherhood or aging or beauty standards or any of that toxicity. So it is this moment of like really fertile kind of investigation of public womanhood. And that makes me hopeful. And also knowing that there are just so many women artists out there who are passing these ideas, not just women, men too, but like who are passing all these trends in their own way and finding something new and also projecting something different into the future.
Yeah, no, I find that I know you have young kids as well. I have two as well, and I am so interested and heartened by the media that they're consuming that's being made by millennials, right? Like that is now affirming them and setting them up in ways that, I mean, we'll see how it proceeds as they become teenagers, but we're going to think about that tomorrow. But it is heartening to see that shift.
No, I agree, and also just to see the ways in which they're being raised by that, not obviously by me, but
you're doing a great job.
Yeah, also by me. I'm a great mother. No, but by at school, like the ways in which people think about not punishment, but like how can you teach someone to think about their own bad choices, as we say.
Gosh, my kids' schools are teaching self-regulation, y'all, and it's amazing. It's like night and day. It's a wonderful, heartening thing to see.
And just the emphasis on kindness, I think, was not around when I was a kid. So it sort of does make you hopeful when you see all these other little kids in there.
The kids are all right.
They're doing the best.
Yeah. We're gonna do better by them. Questions, y'all. The floor is yours. Yes.
It sort of ties in, I think, to what I was. Should we repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, there was in your excerpt in The Atlantic, you've sort of pulled part of the book that focuses on the shift that happened fairly dramatically in the 2010s, reacting more strongly, pushing back more firmly against the type of behavior we were seeing towards women in the early aughts. I hope I captured that. Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Cheers.
I think what was interesting about the 2010s was there was just this exhaustion with so much of it. And it was really encapsulated, I think, by the Robin Thicke Miley Cyrus performance of Blurred Lines. I don't know if you remember, where she comes out in her like tiny little flesh colored like vinyl ones. I'm trying to think of how to describe it. I can see it in my head. It was flesh colored vinyl bikini. She's a giant foam finger, like this twerking. And everyone was just like, no, no, we don't want this anymore. We're so tired. None of this, please. And it kind of seemed to be the death knell for that moment of like 2000s objectification because no one wanted it anymore. I mean, women weren't willing to accept it anymore and to see it as entertainment. And so I don't know how to sort of better encapsulate it. And it did feel like enough is enough. But also, I mean, everything becomes cringe, as we have said. So there's always going to be a sort of a counter movement. But it was fascinating to me how, say, Judd Apatow is making, Knocked Up, and then he goes and promotes Lena Dunham and Girls, and it's a vibe shift. So I don't know how to say it better than that.
It's true. Yes. Mm-hmm. Great question. I'll repeat it back while you ponder the answer. The question is whether there is a connection to be made between the structure of gender in that moment and the sort of deconstructure of gender that we've seen in the years since the early aughts.
Maybe. I mean, I definitely, so much of what it frustrated me throughout the book was like so much of the culture in this moment was just so binary, right? Like, and there was such a specific way for women, especially to look if they wanted to appear on screen, to be visible, to be deemed acceptable as like totems of womanhood. And it was very, very narrow. So yeah, I mean, it would absolutely make sense to me that yes, what it created then was this, again, this counter movement of like being unwilling to accept those terms anymore because they're annoying.
Absolutely. Yes. The question is your thoughts on purity culture.
I do have thoughts. It's actually in the introduction, I think, just trying to capture this moment in the 2000s when teenage pop stars were so required to be like sexy and virginal at the same time, like to look super sexy and to be super alluring in ways that could sell things to teenage girls, but also to be chaste in ways that would not let them sell things to housewives in the middle of the country. Do you know what I mean? It was like this impossible balancing act. And I think it's part of what made it so hard to sort of tick the boxes in that era because no one can pull that balancing act off. But it's fascinating, like with something like Newlyweds, the Jessica Simpson reality show, which I was a big fan of in the time. Yeah. I mean, there had been so much made of her virginity, right? And like the idea that she was saving herself for marriage. And part of the spectacle of that show seemed to be like that she was no longer a virgin. She was married now. Like you would get this kind of like creepy, slightly pervy gaze into her married life with her husband. And it just reminded me of like in aristocratic France when they would like hang the bed sheets up like after the bride had been deflowered. There was something about it that seemed to like tap into that tradition. Sorry, I'm getting away from purity culture, but yes, I do have feelings.
I will briefly, if you have not read Jessica Simpson's memoir, it's so good. And it really, I think she was like this somewhat unwitting poster person for that concept in a lot of ways.
But also her dad kept talking about her boobs. He kept talking about how sexy she was. He gave this interview where he's like, she's got double D's. You can't cover those suckers up. And it was just like, that's your child.
Yeah. And as you note, it's like this weird throwback to like the father promising the bride to this bridegroom, and behold, they have sealed their union. It's very creepy. Any questions on this side of the room? Yes. Yeah, great question. What you saw in your research that sort of connects the sort of breakdown of certain movements and the rise of individualism, and the economics of the culture that we all inhabit. I don't know if I fully caught all that, but it was a great question. I'm sorry.
No, it was a great question. I can't really do it justice, but not to come back to the Spice Girls, but I will.
All roads lead back to the Spice
And
Girls.
sort of as avatars for post-feminism, they were so much about like individual freedom, right? Like we'd lost the idea of kind of collective action, collective sisterhood, working to make things better for all women, struggling to sort of agitate for meaningful change for all women in our society. Instead, it was very much this idea of like, you're free now. Like, buy whatever lipstick you want, wear whatever you want. No feminist is going to scold you for your skirt being too sexy. Do you know, like this straw man idea of feminism? But it was so tied up with the need to sell things. And I think the Spice Girls, within the first year and a half of a band, they had something like $500 million worth of branding and merchandising deals. Someone told me once they had a Spice Girls toaster. But they had like lollipops, lipstick, like Target, every single brand had a Spice Girls tie-in. And once people saw how effective they were at selling things, and also for some reason awoke to the idea that teenage girls had spending money because they had babysitting gigs and didn't have mortgages. They saw the power of teenage girls as a demographic, and that was really what brought about the shift into the kind of Britney era, where it was so much about just selling things. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but hopefully.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And also we're in this moment suggests that we're in this moment of backlash to that, right? With men, podcasters who talk for 3 hours about like how everything is called women, and I'm sort of loath to be like, if you're book talk on girl power, can you talk about men? But I was wondering if there's sort of a parallel to the male rage of today, the reactionary.
Another great question that I feel I will not do full justice to, but I think the idea is if you saw a parallel in sort of the era that you're writing about to the polling, the data that we see about how Gen Z men are behaving right now. I feel like I maybe left it on the note. And the resentment, the resentment.
Yes. Yeah, the first chapter of the book is about music. And it opens, I think, with a quote from the writer Jessica Hopper from her essay on emo at the time, and how she felt as a fan of emo, how much it was kind of treating women as these like empty love interests who are fetishized, but like there are no girls in emo bands. Like it's just very much this male genre. But there was so much of the music of that era that was rageful, like Eminem. I mean, fantasizing about ripping Hillary Clinton's tonsils out. Like, and there was a study. I love this study, and my editor wanted to cut it, but I'm so glad it's in the book. There was a study about they took young men in Germany and they made them listen to songs like The Offspring and Eminem, and then they asked them to make sandwiches for women. And the men who had listened to the misogynistic lyrics put more hot sauce in the sandwiches for the women, implying that they had internalized this sort of hatred and this desire to punish them. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that was something like Woodstock '99, where you had seen the energy of Lilith Fair like be completely obliterated by this like just very angry, rageful burn things down, where women were sexually assaulted and abused and belittled. It was sort of the real energy of that shift in 1999 and onwards. And it's interesting now because someone like Eminem too has like softened in so many ways and is, you know, tweeting about the end of Roe and why women need reproductive rights. But yeah, maybe he'll write a book one day.
Yeah. I mean, that was another really jarring rereading some of those lyrics is really jarring. And you have another study that you quote that I found really alarming too, from the British Journal of Psychology, that found many young men weren't able to distinguish between derogatory quotes taken from men's magazines of the time and quotes from convicted rapists. So to your point, like that level of just
Yeah.
loathing towards women.
Yeah, that it was, and you see it sort of in Russell Brand's stand-up routines. There was just this very normalized, like belittling, really ugly rage at women that was very widespread at the time.
Yeah, I think it does have a tail to your question, right? Like I think we still see and feel the effects of that today, and which is why I so appreciate this work, because it helps connect those dots to where we are now. More questions. We have a question from the internet. Oh, interesting question. In 20 years, what do you think we'll be reassessing from this moment in the same way we're looking back now and saying, oh, wow, Snoop Dogg, we thought you were sweet.
It's weird because, and it comes back to your point about the manosphere too. Like there is, of course, this very vocal, very popular, very influential medium that is sending out very familiar messages to young men and boys, but it hasn't really been adopted by mainstream culture in the way that it was in the 2000s. Like I would say, you don't really see people like Andrew Tate be that kind of language is not coming across in like mainstream TV shows and movies. It's very much relegated to its forum, I think. So I don't know. That is such a good question, but I do hope there'll be a lot more analysis of the manosphere. I'm trying to think if there's anything problematic that I personally would like to cancel.
Those 3-hour-long podcasts of just two dudes talking every day. But I think that is an interesting point you make, though, that we have seen since the time you're writing about the splintering and the segmentation of the audience is so significant that it is hard to find something that takes on the same momentum, right? And that same sense of total infusion in this moment. It will be interesting to see where we are 20 years from now.
Yeah, but I mean, there's an optimism in that too, because I just remember as a teenager feeling that things were very wrong in how I was being treated, but not feeling like I had the language or the capacity to push back against it. And there is so, like, the nice thing about culture being splintered is if you're a girl now, you can find that voice. Yes. It's so much easier to find someone who will vocalize the way that you're feeling and make it cohesive to you and ways you can break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably have time for about 2 more questions, folks. Yes.
Hi, Marissa.
Oh my God, that makes me sound so noble.
The question is sort of, how did you protect yourself as you were doing some of this research, especially into the really dark elements of the book? Because there is a lot of darkness. There's light, there's some funny and fun parts, but there's also a lot of darkness that you dove into.
Yeah, chapter 6 is very dark. It's about torture porn, the rise of torture porn, the sort of tend towards extremity in culture in ways that were happening in pornography, but also in movie making, in art house film, in schlocky horror films. And that one was very dark. So I definitely had some troubled sleep when I was writing that chapter. But what was, I mean, as you mentioned, I have twins and they just don't care. They don't care about anything. They are very selfish. They don't. So there's no space for like, oh, I'm dealing with something really heavy today. They're just like, whatever. Like,
I need a snack.
Yeah.
I'm projecting my kids onto your kids.
Yeah. No, that's exactly. There's endless snacks. So that kind of is a nice distraction, but also what was so thrilling to me was when I would find ways that made it make sense to me. Like I'd wrote, this is going to make it sound insane, but there's a lot in that chapter that looks at the imagery from Abu Ghraib and how much it seemed to be mimicking trends in porn at the time. And then I found this old American Apparel ad from 2011 where they had staged female models in a human pyramid, very much like seeming to nod back to the photos from Abu Ghraib, and it was like, I think it just showed all the ways in which different kinds of bodies were being dehumanized in all different forms of media at the time in this way that was supposed to cement white male power and to understand that like sexual dominance was the clearest expression of that power in lots of ways, and it would be weaponized against women, but not just women. It would also be weaponized against soldiers in a not soldiers, I'm sorry, inmates in a prison. Yeah.
No, it's a really powerful chapter, but it is very dark. But that connection is, as you know, something that as a reader, I'm grateful that you made those connections, because it once you hit that, you're like, oh yes, this seems clear now. Troubling and clear. One more question. Yes.
So you've talked a lot about the cultural megastars in the 90s, but then the 2010s, when social media came around, kind of let everyone become their own trendsetter or influencer. What do you think that what happened that on the trends you discussed?
Great question. So in the early aughts, we had these sort of centers of gravity that we were all looking towards, to Jessica Simpson's telling us, not telling us to buy Chicken of the Sea. I don't know. But now, and then as social media rose, we all have, not me, let's be clear, but like there is a greater democracy of influencing across social media. How do you think of that sort of interplay?
I think what was helpful to me was sort of realizing how much our moment of influences came from this, from the 2000s, and from this real shift in what it meant to be famous. Because I really, like, before the 2000s, if you wanted to be famous, you had to be good at something, right? Like you had to be a musician or an actor or a model, or like you had a thing that you were good at and you were famous for that. And then suddenly there was this industrialized paparazzi machine that wanted pictures to feed to magazines, and it was immensely profitable. There was all this empty space on the internet that needed filling with pictures because we love pictures. And what that did was kind of change the nature of who could be a celebrity. And all you had to do, if anyone was a reader of like Go Fug Yourself back in the 2000s, yeah, you remember all those women who would just like go to red carpets and really crazy outfits, and they were like micro celebrities because they were visible in the right kind of way. But it really did open up this new medium of reality TV stars like Kim Kardashian, who are just so good at being visible, and they really make it their art form, and they know what people want to see, and they don't mind that people simultaneously will hate them for that visibility. They're able to just kind of accept the terms and watch the money come in. I'm not sure I've answered your question either, but it was interesting to see how much of our sort of influencer moment now came from reality TV and just the sudden democratization of celebrity.
I think that's a great note to end it on. Sophie, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
I'm going to hand it over to Lainey Rose to give us our instructions, our marching orders.